You can't see it here, but there's an invisible radiation beating down on me from above. As I stood gazing up at this cell tower, it wasn't long before my skin began to tingle and turn slightly red. I quickly felt the onset of a headache that I could only alleviate by sleeping for the rest of the afternoon. My forehead was covered in beads of sweat, my palms were clammy, and I felt weak. I was thirsty. It was a thirst that was almost impossible to quench. Standing here for much longer would leave me in danger, so I left and sheltered from the radiation for my own safety. And as I looked in the mirror at home at my reddened face, I remembered, summer has arrived in Britain, and it took me by surprise because it's almost 3 months late. UV radiation from the sun can seriously damage your skin. Always wear sun cream. In my recent video on 5G and the fact that it's harmless to you and me as it radiates from the tops of cell towers, providing us with the mobile phone infrastructure we desperately crave, I was jumped on by the 5G nuts. I was bombarded with links to harebrained, uneducated videos, websites and documents without any peer-reviewed evidence to back them up. I was told to watch videos by people who walk around the town taking measurements from cell towers on £20 EMF devices. Videos in which these EMF devices are also picking up every other source of RF in the area, and the results presented as science, proof that 5G is killing us. I was jumped upon for quoting official government and independent research, as if the people who present this research don't also live in the real world alongside us peasants, and aren't showered with the same 5G killer radiation that we are. So it got me thinking about something I remembered researching a while ago, the Stewart report and the Ofcom mobile phone base station audits. Now, like my other 4G and 5G videos, this isn't designed to get the conspiracy nuts to agree with me. I'm just presenting you with factual information. One chap quite rightly said, "But Lewis, we don't have evidence that 5G is dangerous now, but we may do in years to come." And he's quite right. But until that time, we can only go off what we know. So, in order to address developing concerns throughout the late 1990s, the Department of Health and the Department of Trade and Industry decided to sponsor a review of the health effects associated with mobile phone telecommunications. The Public Health Minister at that time asked the chairman of the National Radiological Protection Board, or NRPB, to set up an independent expert group on mobile phones, also known as IEGMP. The remit of the IEGMP was, quote, to consider present concerns about the possible health effects from the use of mobile phones, base stations and transmitters, to conduct a rigorous assessment of existing research and to give advice based on the present state of knowledge, and to make recommendations on further work that should be conducted to improve the basis for sound advice. The IEGMP came together in September 1999 under the chairmanship of Sir William Stewart. Following 10 meetings of the IEGMP through to April 2000, after hearing evidence from 30 witnesses, listening to the public views at 5 open meetings in Belfast, London, Liverpool, Edinburgh and Cardiff, and reviewing hundreds of scientific papers and extensive media coverage of the issue, the IEGMP published a report entitled Mobile Phones and Health, or the Stewart Report, in May 2000. The Stewart report provided information on the interaction of radio frequency fields with tissues. It examined epidemiological or human health studies, research on cells in culture, experimental animals, as well as on volunteers, and concerns about the use of mobile phones whilst driving. It also described the operation of mobile phones and reviewed recommendations on exposure standards for RF radiation. The main conclusion on health effects in the Stewart report can be summarised as follows. Exposure to RF radiation below guidelines does not cause adverse health effects to the general population. There may be some scientific evidence which suggests that there may be biological effects occurring at exposures below these guidelines, and biological effects do not necessarily result in health effects, and we'll come to this later on. And gaps in knowledge justify a precautionary approach to the use of mobile phone technologies until more detailed and scientifically robust information on any health effects becomes available. The review of the scientific information relevant to concerns about exposure to RF radiation was comprehensive and did not demonstrate any clear health effects caused by the use of mobile phones or being in proximity to base stations. However, from the evidence heard by the IEGMP, it was clear that there was considerable public concern about the possible health implications of the use of this rapidly developing technology. The Stewart report contained 33 recommendations, many of which were designed to provide more information about phones and base stations. A couple of key points were firstly that exposure guidelines recommended by the NRPB in 1993 and 1999 and by the International Commission of Non-ionising Radiation Protection in 1998 for limiting exposure to electromagnetic fields and radiations are based on comprehensive reviews of the scientific information available and are designed to prevent established adverse health effects. The earlier recommendations by the NRPB in 1993 were designed to limit any increase in body temperature to a fraction of a degree. The rationale behind the ICN-IRP exposure guidelines in 1998 was essentially the same as those of the NRPB, but a two-tier system was recommended by the ICN-IRP that made a distinction between occupational and general public exposure. Reductions in basic restrictions by a factor of 5 were recommended for members of the public compared with those for workers on the assumption that age and health status, and hence thermal sensitivity, may be different from those for workers. Although little scientific justification for this reduction factor was given, members of the public include the frail, infants and young children, and people with disease or taking medicine that may compromise thermal tolerance. The IEGMP recommended that, as a precautionary approach, the ICN-IRP guidelines for public exposure be adopted for use in the UK rather than the NRPB guidelines, therefore bringing the UK into line with other countries in the European Union and accord with the recommendations of the House of Commons Select Committee on Science and Technology. Secondly, one of the recommendations of the IEGMP was that there should be an independent ongoing audit of base stations, with base stations near schools and other sensitive sites as a priority. It was suggested that children might be especially vulnerable to any adverse health effects of RF radiation. There is evidence that at the frequencies used in mobile phone technology, children will absorb more energy per kilogram of body weight from an external electromagnetic field than adults. Additionally, since children are being exposed to RF radiation from base stations from a younger age than adults, they'll have a longer time in which to accumulate exposure over the course of their lives, and a longer time for any delayed effects of exposure to develop. Now, the Stewart report isn't available for public download. You have to pay for it, and this is probably just as well. You see, the 5G conspiracy nuts tend to pick out the points I just mentioned, cell towers near schools and children absorbing more radiation, etc., and run with it to support their argument. They don't look at all of the evidence we have at present because too much of it goes against their argument. So let's look at these audits in more detail. In 2001, the Radio Communications Agency, an executive arm of the Department of Trade and Industry, measured emissions from 100 base stations throughout the UK, with the emphasis on measurements of sites near to schools. Recorded exposures were well within guidelines and not considered hazardous. A further 109 sites, 82 schools and 27 hospitals were sampled in 2002 in the second phase of the audit process. Results of the study, published in February 2003, showed that readings ranged between 1,731 to 1,19,907,515 of the international exposure limit set by the ICN-IRP. The lowest and highest readings of the study were recorded at Enniskillen Model Primary School, 1,19,907,515, and Aintree Hospital in Liverpool, 1,731 respectively. These measurements demonstrated that exposures arose not only from base stations, but also a wide variety of sources including TV and radio transmitters, satellites, pagers and radar. Often signals from a distant base station can give higher exposure than those from a local base station, as the antennas tend to be directed towards the horizon. I covered planning and location in my last 5G video, which I'll link below. Today, Ofcom, the Office of Communications, is the communications industry regulator with wide-ranging responsibilities across the UK's communication markets, including managing the UK civil radio spectrum. Since 2001, Ofcom and its predecessor, the Radio Communications Agency, have conducted a programme of measurements showing that emission levels around mobile phone base stations were consistently found to be only a very small fraction of the safety levels for exposure published by the UK Health Protection Agency. Although the ongoing programme of measurements finished in 2012, Ofcom remains able to survey sites if requested to do so, and there's been over 740 completed to date. The emphasis of the programme continues to be with schools and hospitals as outlined in the Stewart report, although they will consider requests for surveys in locations where there's unrestricted public access and concern about signal levels. Ofcom's remit is only the measurement, not any wider interpretation of field strengths, to ensure compliance with guidance published by the ICN IRP. The surveys are a chargeable service. However, Ofcom recognises that there's still a general level of concern around emissions from mobile phone masts, particularly near buildings such as schools and hospitals, about the perceived effect that they might have on the health of the public in their communities. For this reason, assessments for schools and hospitals are conducted on a free of charge basis. This is subject to conditions, however. If the mast is installed on a school or hospital site and they're receiving funding for it from a mobile phone operator, the standard survey charge will apply. Ofcom offers two levels of survey, standard and enterprise. For a standard survey, measurements are usually taken from 3 locations around the mast in question. Subject to operational constraints, you can expect to report back to you within 3 months of the application being accepted. You'll receive an ICN IRP measurement certificate at the completion of the work, and the cost of the standard survey is £425.20 excluding VAT. Those seeking a more comprehensive survey may request an enterprise survey. Measurements are taken at 10 to 15 locations around the mast. Again, subject to operational constraints, Ofcom expects to conduct the measurements and provide a report to you within 1 month of the application being accepted. You'll receive a report of the measurements taken similar to this, and the cost of the enterprise survey is £1,103.20 excluding VAT. So, looking at all of the data, and for this video I trawled through hundreds of these audit reports, you can see that cell towers are completely harmless in their current configuration. I mention this a lot, and still, many people jump on me in the comments. They say things like, what if you put your head near a cellular antenna, and why is there a whole host of warning signs on cell towers if they're safe, and I'll clear this up again here. Firstly, let's talk about current configuration. At ground level, in your house, in your car, or on the street, you're completely safe. The radio frequency radiation from a cellular tower will have no effect on you whatsoever. Up at the top of the mast, of course, things are different. Up here, at antenna height, 5G is dangerous, but this has nothing to do with 5G. You don't want to be close to any transmitting antenna for too long. Not because it'll change your DNA, as lots of people told me in the last video, that's ionising radiation. Radiation that has enough energy to break an electron away from an atom, a process called ionisation. Because ionising radiation has enough energy to remove electrons from atoms, it has the ability to change the chemical composition of the material it interacts with, i.e. you. Everything you'll find on these sorts of towers emits non-ionising radiation. It doesn't have enough energy to remove an electron from an atom or molecule, so why is it dangerous up close? Well, the eye, for example, is considered to be a critical organ when determining safety standards for radio frequency radiation. Experimental data obtained using animals showed that RF heating of the eye, particularly over a specific threshold, can induce cataracts. While non-ionising radiation isn't strong enough to directly affect the structure of atoms or damage DNA, it does cause atoms to vibrate, which can in turn cause them to heat up. This is what is often classified as the thermal effects of 5G, but again it applies to many other applications. In my other video I mentioned inverse square law. It states that a signal decreases by the square of the distance. For example, if you stand 1 foot away from a transmitter and get a power measurement of 100 for argument's sake, At 2 feet away, it'll be 25 and so on. You'll find that the body receives more RF exposure from your actual mobile phone than a cell tower in the local area. Despite all of this, it's important to remember that at ground level, where the public are allowed to be, the thermal effects of towers like this are non-existent. I should also mention that the warning signs are in place because radio sites carry massive voltages, and workers can receive electric shocks from faulty equipment, exposed cabling, or equipment that hasn't been prepared for works properly. RF burns from antennas are a danger too, and can be painful, deep, and cause a lot of damage. So that's a look at the audit procedure for cell towers. They still go on today and can be requested through Ofcom.